chapter Genesis. We began to think about Genesis chapter 5. We started with the opening verse of chapter 5. This is the account. This is the account of the descendants of Adam. The exact Hebrew word is zes sefer. This is the book. The word for book is the same as the word for story. Sefer, sipur, sofer. The word for an author or a scribe or a book or a story is all the same letters, samach fe resh. So this is probably more accurately translated. This is the book of the Chronicles of Man. And we discussed verse 1 and 2 last week, that despite all the tribulations that we read about in the last few weeks, in the last few chapters, about the story with all the sins, all the debacles with the Garden of Eden, and then Cain killing Hevel, etc. Nevertheless, when the Torah comes to sum up, what do we know? What's the story of man? Verse 1 and 2 of chapter 5 are very optimistic. It talks about how they're created in the image of God, and how male and female, they're one entity. There's no animosity and competition between the two. In other words, there's a healthy balance between the two. And that's the story we read. And of course, the takeaway is that Judaism's perspective is that essentially the story of man is the image of God. Then there's challenges and difficulties and inclinations that are negative, but that doesn't define the human being, even after everything we read in the first 4 chapters, as we discussed last week. We also discussed the idea of the sefer. What's the story? A story means to have a story, you need a common thread. Just random events do not create a story. So what's the story of the Chronicles of Man? So the story is, you look around, it seems a little bit random. You see people that are becoming corrupt. You say a few people that are staying righteous. What is the story? What's the big picture here? What's the common picture? So one interpretation is the common picture is the day that God created them in his image. In other words, his image represents the human capacity for free choice. The only things that have free choice in this universe, even in the spiritual universes, is God himself and the human being. All created beings, they just follow their nature. All angels follow their nature. They don't change. Only the human being has the capacity for free choice. So you want to know everything. What's the common thread in everything we're going to read about is the fact that they were in the image of God, and we have the choice, and that's what makes us unique. So that is the introductory verses that we discussed last week. And now we get the entire chapter 5 from verse 2 all the way to verse 1 and 2, all the way to really verse 31, gets us to Noach. We go 10 generations from Adam to Noach. And most of those generations, it just tells us the amount of time the person lived, the age at which he gave birth to a son, and then the amount of time he lived after giving birth to the son. And then next generation, and then it says he gave birth to many children, and then he dies. And it goes to 10 generations. We don't have too much information except for 2 people. We read a little bit about a gentleman named Chanoch, which we'll discuss, and we read about Noach's father. So we don't get too much information, but just to get a feel for the pattern, how this works. If you look, for example, at verse 6, chapter 5, verse 6, Seth lived 150 years, 105 years, and begot Enosh. And Seth lived 807 years after begetting Enosh, and he begot sons and daughters. All the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Next thing, Enosh lived 90 years and begot Canaan. And Enosh lived 815 years before begetting Canaan, and he begot sons and daughters. After begetting Canaan, and he begot sons and daughters. So he lives 90 years, then he has a child, then he lives 815 years. And the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died, etc., etc. And that's how we get to 10 generations all the way to Noach. So now there's a lot to talk about. The question is what we want to talk about. I think somebody asked last week, I think it was Jill, I may be wrong. What do we do with these extended periods of time that the people are living exceedingly long lives? You have Adam living 930 years. You have Sheth living 912 years. Enosh He dies a very young man, 905 years. What are we supposed to do with these figures? So the short answer is that I don't know. One interpretation, some people try to offer that these years are not referring to the years the way we count time, which is the solar year, because that would be very hard to accept. So they say perhaps they had another way of counting time, which is possible. Others disagree. They say, look, the Torah is using these years to convey, in other words, there's no indication that the years here are any different than the years that are going to be post the flood, for example. So they refuse to accept that it's different type of years. So there's disagreement amongst the sages. One interesting disagreement amongst the sages is the question of, were these people the exception? Let's assume that that Adam lived for 930 years. Okay, just bear with me for one moment. Does this mean that this is the exception or the rule? In other words, are you saying that only these 10 people that we list live exceedingly long lives, or is it something of that the entire generation does? Everybody lives this amount of time, and this is a disagreement. Some people say it was the nature then. They didn't eat as much ice cream and chocolate cake, and therefore they were healthier. Other people say that by the flood, the nature of man was weakened, but it was the entire generation. Others say no, it wasn't the entire generation. It was only these select individuals that lived an exceedingly long lives. Now, why? So that's the disagreement. Again, I'm not telling you what to accept and what to say. I'm just passing it on. The question now becomes, what would be the purpose of living 930 years or 912 years or 906 years? What are we trying, what's the message here? In other words, why, let's assume that this was not the common thing, that most people lived a more common lifespan. Why would God make some individuals live so long? There's a Talmudic story where there was a sage that, long story short, he went to sleep and he hibernated for 70 years. And he woke up 70 years later and nobody knew who he was and he had no friends. He prayed to God and he said, God, take my soul away. And he passed away that day. So you don't want to live 900 years after everybody else in your class, after everybody else in your high school class. So what would be the purpose of having these people live so long? And I saw a fascinating interpretation from a great sage named the Rav Bach. And he says as follows. He says, look, he says, in the beginning of history, there would be a benefit to living long, at least for certain individuals. What is the benefit? He says, for us, we already accumulate knowledge from previous generations, so we can have knowledge passed on. But what happens if people are trying to investigate the world around them? You need time to start learning about the natural phenomenon, to do natural experiments, to do scientific experiments, to see how things work. You need time for this. And if everybody would die after 80 years, then you wouldn't be able to get a scientific development off the ground, because a person learns from experience, and he doesn't have enough time to gain that kind of experience. And therefore, when you have some people living long, so he says, this is something we could learn, and this is something this is how they convey knowledge. Now he says this is true about scientific knowledge, but it's also true about moral knowledge and philosophical knowledge, right? As you get older, you learn certain things that you have not thought about when you were a child. So the point here is that if everybody would the fact that there are some individuals that live long, again, assuming it's only some, what that does is it allows for humanity to develop certain perspectives, both scientific and philosophical, that they simply need time to develop, as opposed to later on, once we're building on knowledge that has already been accumulated, then we don't have to live that long to be able to learn what we need to learn. So I think, in other words, before any of the the way he says it is, before any of the experiments can bear fruit, if people would die young, they would not be able to they see their experiments bearing fruit, and therefore knowledge would not be able to accumulate. So I thought that was interesting. And he says, so again, he says this is a miracle, this is unusual, and there were certain individuals that live long, and the purpose being so humanity can gain knowledge, both scientific and moral and philosophical. That's what I read. I thought that was an interesting perspective.
And this is kind of in line with what happened to Cain, because his kind of long life sentence came after what he did, probably to accumulate some knowledge and to learn from the experience.
Yes. And the way he puts it is the actual experience when you're young, you're in other words, when you're young, he says, the Ralbag says, 13th century sage, he says, when you're young, your senses mislead you. In other words, when you're young, you're drawn to do things that he calls that are arev, that are sweet, things that are pleasing to the senses. But as you get older, that's when you start getting experience, and you have long-term experience, and you start realizing that what brings instant happiness doesn't necessarily bring long-term happiness. Okay, but we know this because our bubby told that to us. But what about the bubby? How did the first bubby know about this? In other words, how did they figure this out in the early generations? So for the list of 40 years, and you're just trying to survive, then you don't have time to think about the big picture of life, either both scientific but also moral and philosophical. And according to the Ralbag again, that is why God performs this miracle, to allow people to have life experience, to allow them to gain almost like a head start in their scientific and philosophical and moral inquiry. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, this is not related. I mean, I was thinking about that when I was comparing the age of Cain, because he was the first one who was sentenced to live longer. But also I had a question not related to that. When Seth was created, it was created in the image of man. Was it the image of man or Adam, or in the image of God? He created, this is verse.
Yeah, verse 3.
His likeness and his image. He begot in his likeness. So what happened to the God's images? I mean, this is kind of repetitive, because Adam was created in the image of God. So why is it in his image? So is that alluded to, referring to kind of passing the knowledge to what we talked about before?
Yeah, so what you're alluding to is verse 3, where it says that Adam gives birth in his likeness and his image, and he names his son Seth, Shet. So if you see in the Art Scroll, he quotes both the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban. This doesn't mean that that doesn't mean Shet is not in the image of God, is in the image of Adam. It's to the contrary. It's highlighting the point that not only was Adam and Eve, who were directly created by God, were they created in God's image, but the verse here is saying a greater novelty, that Adam, who was created in God's image, has the capacity to reproduce in the image of God. So it does say he gives birth in his image, but what is his image? His image is the image of God. So in other words, that ability that not only the first in line, right, not only the one closest to the actual creation is in the image of God, but that ability to pass that image of God onto the offsprings, that is the big news here. Now, if that's the big news, why didn't it say it earlier?
Before.
Why didn't it say it earlier? So here they say too, they say, look, the Torah doesn't want to emphasize it because their descendants become wicked. So why would you emphasize it? If you have to emphasize that humanity is in the image of God, we'd rather emphasize it. If you have to put it somewhere, you're not going to repeat it all three times with all three sons, Cain, Hevel, Shet. So if you're going to emphasize it, you emphasize it with the descendants of Shet, who will ultimately Shet becomes the father of humanity, because Shet is the father of Noah. Okay.
And also not only the image, but also passing the knowledge and experience, maybe in that sense also.
Right. Yeah. So that, yeah, but I think begetting, Vayola, giving birth, is much more essential than knowledge. Knowledge is accumulated, knowledge is added I think this is a much stronger term, that you give birth in your image. That means that sort of defines the offsprings, regardless of how they actually choose to act or choose to accumulate knowledge or ignore the accumulated knowledge. I think this is much more powerful, discussing sort of the essence of what it means to be human, what it means to be a descendant of Adam. Again, not just Jewish, but this is really, we discussed this last week, that this verse really expands the idea of, we said Rabbi Akiva says the principle of the Torah is love your fellow as yourself. Your fellow could mean Jew because he's like you, but here it says, this is the book of the Chronicles of man. God creates man in his image. This verse, according to Ben Azai, broadens the moral responsibility that people have to each other, to all of humanity, because this is very powerful. And again, this is really this essential foundation for human rights, and why we have to give every person dignity comes from these verses, and verses in the beginning of the Torah, but again, re-emphasized here in chapter 5, even after everything you read about humanity, which not all of it is pretty, but don't get distracted from the essence. The essence is that man is created in the image of God, and man has the ability to, and man conveys that image to his offsprings. And that's the source of human dignity. Okay, let's think about a little bit here. What do we get from all this information? You could have just told me I have 10 generations from Adam to Noach. I have to get all of the, I need to hear all the names and all the years. Why do I need to know this? Like I alluded to earlier, we have some information at Chanoch and some at Noach's father Lemech, but we'll get to that later. Let's first think about the 10 generations. And just like we did with the descendants of Cain, we're going to look at the descendants of Shet, and we're going to look at the names. And we're going to try to compare the lineage of Cain and the lineage of Shet based on their names. And as if you remember, just to refresh your memory, when we looked at the descendants of Cain, we saw a descent. All the names represent descent. Let's just run by quickly. I'm turning back to chapter 4. Turning in the art scroll, it's on page 23. And we read, you had Cain in verse, so Cain was born. Then you have verse 18 on page 23 was Chanoch. Chanoch means education, which is a fine name. The next one you had in verse 18 was Irad. Irad could either mean city, ear, but it also has the Dalid, which could mean Rad is descent. So Irad, city descending. So you have the Cain, which is acquiring man with God, very positive. You have Chanoch, which is education, which is positive. But then you get to Irad, city descending. Then you have Mechiyael, wiping away God. Metushael, God dying. Lemech, which we don't know anything. Lemech seems neutral. And then you have Lemech's children, which are basically based on their, it highlights their desire for acquisition. We said both Yuval and Tuval Cain comes from the word Yevul, which is produce, which is possessions. But you're seeing a clear descent. Now, that's what happens with Cain's children. If you look at Lemech, if you look at Shet's children, here it gets interesting, because you also have descent. Because remember, most of Seth's children also become corrupt and are also destroyed in the flood, except for one exception, which is Noach and his children, Noach and his 3 children. But what you see about the descent in the names of the children of Seth, which we're going to track in a moment, what you see that the descent is not absolute. Even after names descending, you also have elevation. After names that represent a descent, you also have names that represent an ascent, going upward. And that is a very important point, because the point here is, and we're going to highlight this in a moment, hopefully later today also, is that Cain's perspective is that if my forebears, if my parents have problems, those moral problems are going to be passed on to me, and they define me. So in other words, Cain's children define themselves as descendants of people who are going to kill their brothers. And that's how they understand their humanity. They see themselves as trapped by human nature. And that's really the source of the descent, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, in contrast, when you look at the children of Seth, what do you learn? Shet, what do you learn? What do you see? That even people who followed a descent, when it came to naming their children, they give them names, which again represents the idea of an ascent. And they say you're not trapped by the lifestyles and the decisions and the moral choices of the people before you. And that is the key to allow for the emergence of Noach, because you have to grow up in a society that believes that there's, I guess I can call it social mobility in the moral sense, right? That you can grow, you can actually outperform your parents or your parents' generation, not necessarily economically, maybe that too, but more importantly, spiritually and morally. So we're going to go a quick road through a quick ride through the ages, through the 10 generations, try to track their names, try to translate them to the best of our ability, and show that there's a descent, but then surprisingly, there's an ascent. So we'll try to do that. We'll try to do that quickly. So you have Shet. Shet is a wonderful name. I'm looking at the first page 25, verse 6. The passing of Shet is verse 6 describes his son. So Shet is a wonderful name. The word Shet means establishing. Eve names her son Shet because God established for me a third child instead of Hevel because Cain killed him. And Shet becomes the name. It means establishing because the world was established from Shet. What's Shet's son? Enosh. Enosh is already a problem. Enosh means weakness. We discussed this on the previous chapter, that there are 4 names for man. There's Adam, and there's Ish, Gever, and Enosh. Of the 4 names, the sort of lowest, in other words, the name that represents human weakness, that's Enosh. When you want to highlight human weakness, you say Enosh. So you have Shet is the foundation of the world. That's a name that represents strength and power and endurance. And his child is already a descent. It represents that the people over there, when it came time to name their child, they give a name that highlights the weakness of man. Okay. Enosh, that's verse 6. Enosh lives 90 years, gives a birth to Canaan. I don't know what Canaan means. Very close to Cain. Cain, I guess, could be positive or negative, depending how you read it. It could mean possessions, but it could mean also a person who, like Eve named Cain, I acquired man with God. In other words, a partnership with God. So you can read Canaan as an ascent. After the descent of Shet, of Enosh, which means weakness, you can go upward to Cain. After Cain, you have a beautiful name, 13. Mahalalel. Mahalalel, what a beautiful name. Mahalalel literally means praise God. Hallel is praise. Mahalalel, the name that praises God. What a wonderful name. Okay. After Mahalalel, what do you have? In verse 15, he gives birth to Yared. Yared is as clear as day. You don't have to know much Hebrew. You don't have to manipulate the word. Yared means descent, going downward. It's as clear as that, like raid, like go down. Yarad is going down. So after Mahalalel, after the person who praises God, you have going downward, right? That's very easy to make that connection. After Yered, which means going down, you have verse 19. Verse 19 is it gives birth to Chanoch. Chanoch is education. We already said before, education in the lineage of Cain was something good. So after descent, you have education. The people realize that even though the generation has descended, but you can educate somebody to actually grow and be morally upright. And then Chanoch gives birth, education gives birth in verse 22. In verse 21, he gives birth to Metushelach. Metushelach, I don't know exactly what it means. Not great name. It has the term met, which is death. Shelach means sent away. Who they sending away, I don't know. But Metushelach doesn't necessarily, at least doesn't sound that positive. And again, it came after Chanoch, which came after Chanoch, correct. Now we have a story about Chanoch. We're going to skip. We'll get to that later. We turn the page and we get to Lemech. Lemech is neutral. We're not sure about Lemech. We don't know what Lemech means. There's a Lemech here. He has his cousin Lemech, the descendant of Cain. We don't know what Lemech means. Lemech has a son Noach. Noach is positive. There's a debate what it means. Does it mean comfort? Does it mean rest? But Noach is Noach is positive. So what you see with the descendants of Cain, you see a continuous descent. There's no way, there's no generation that says, you know what, we're going to outperform our parents in the moral sense. They keep going down. And that's really the reason of their failure, as we will highlight in a moment. That's because they think that they are defined by human nature. So if I look around and look at the history and I say, this is the history of man in the moral sense, why would I try to change? I'm not going to be able to change it. It's a trap. I'm forced to live by following my instincts, and therefore I may as well get good at living in the jungle. That's the descendants of Cain, and that indeed does not produce anybody that philosophy that will not produce anybody that can be saved from the flood and can save humanity from the flood. When you have Seth's children, make no mistake, we're not saying that they're all holy. In fact, most of them are wiped away, but there's a possibility to Noach. Where do you see it? When the Torah lists the 10 generations, it's not just giving you the ages to give us the timing of when the flood takes place. It's not just for the chronological information. It's also, it alludes to, at least according to some commentaries, it alludes to the moral story. What are the parents telling their children? And how do the children reflect their generation? And what you see is descent does not necessarily continue into the next generation. At some point, some generations are able to say, we're not defined by the past. We can re-educate, we can go upward, we can praise God. We're not we're not trapped by the moral choices of our parents and the parents' generation and the past humanity. We are free to exercise our own free choice. That is the ingredient that will be able to produce a Noach. Without that, there's no Noach, there's no rebuilding of the world. So that's interesting. I'll be kind of confess, when I read this story the first time, when I read the story in yeshiva, nobody gave us this information. Chapter 5 was a very boring chapter, I must tell you. But once you start looking at comparing the names of Noach and the names of the descendants of Cain and the names of the descendants of Shet, you start seeing those patterns of, again, Cain, it's just descent, whereas Shet, it's more of a bumpy road. Then things start becoming interesting and you start getting the moral message that the Torah is signaling to us.
Rabbi, since a child is named at birth and not at his death, is a child destined to become his name? And if so, isn't this the antithesis to free choice?
So the answer is no, it cannot be the antithesis of free choice. I will tell you one of two things. I personally like the latter interpretation, but I'll tell you two. One interpretation would be that the child wasn't necessarily named at birth. In other words, I'm sure they were named at birth, but ultimately the name becomes your title. So in other words, it's very possible that when the Torah says he was named, it means he was named later in life. In other words, he gave birth to Yared, but when did he get the name Yared? Was in Yared the name at his circumcision? Oh, I forgot, there was no circumcision. So when was he named? It could be later in life. But if you don't like that interpretation, I'll tell you what I like better. What I like better is that the name is not necessarily, it's basically, the name is what the parents want for the child. It's aspirational. And therefore, even though it doesn't force the child, but it's going to have some influence on the child. If your parent calls you Mahalalel, the one who praises God, you still have free choice not to praise God, but there's a good chance that you will end up praising God. Now, whether or not you praise God is irrelevant to me. That's not my point. The point is your parents thought that you can praise God even though they didn't praise God, if you see what I'm saying, even though their own generation didn't praise God. Your parents thought that you can be chanoch, that you could be educated, even though the previous generation was not educated. So this is not telling you what they became. It tells you what their parents hoped that they would become. But that's telling enough. That's already enough telling, because it's not important what they became. What's important is how do people self-define. And in the generation of and the descendants of Cain, the parents don't think the children could free themselves from the instincts, from the animalistic instincts of the human being. So they named them names that they hope would make them actually good in the business of living in the jungle, right? So that's really what the Torah is alluding to. But I think that the message cannot be that these people were forced to live by their name. And it's actually interesting because we have a few people that have the same name, but it's most clear with Lemech. There's a Lemech, a descendant of Cain, a Lemech, a descendant of Shet, and they have two completely different attitudes, which the Torah gives us information about those attitudes. We're going to do that in a moment. We'll compare the attitudes of Lemech and the two Lemechs, and you see, even though they got the same name, and Lemech is a neutral name, but they grew up completely different. So the name does not necessarily define you, but it still is enough to tell you something about the philosophy and the ideals and the ideas of the people naming the name, regardless if it happened later in life or at birth. Either way, this could be read as this is some way of learning about the attitudes of the people of that generation, much more than what they actually did. I have no idea if Mahalalel got up every day in the minyan and went to shul and praised God. I don't know. But I do know that someone, either his parents at birth or his colleagues later in life, hoped and named and hoped and aspired to and thought that he would praise God. Okay, that tells me something. That tells me all I need to know.
Rabbi, it may be true the other way around, and also emphasizing free choice, that even if the parents give you the name that has some kind of negative connotation, you're not limited to that. You can always rise above it.
I think that's true. I think that's true. But again, we don't know. The problem is I cannot give a can't give a sermon about that because we don't know anything about their lives. The Torah doesn't tell us anything. It just says he gave birth to a child and he had many other children and he died. So I don't know. I can't, if I'm writing a play, we could sit down here and write a play and figure out and write all kinds of stories about what happens to these people, which will be fascinating. And we can make some money on Broadway. But the point is, this we don't know about. The Torah doesn't tell it to us. So, but the Torah gives us something. So what information could we glean from that which the Torah tells us? So one interpretation is, you don't know what happened to each individual, but look at the patterns. One pattern with Cain, it's names that represent descent. And one pattern is descent, but then an ascent. In other words, the next generation has hope that the previous generation has hope that the next generation can outperform them, and they're not trapped in their moral and with their moral mistakes, because they understand that which we read in chapter 5, verse 1, that man is created in the image of God. And now it just came to me, maybe the reason why the Torah doesn't emphasize that Cain gave birth in the image of God, that was right. We discussed this. It only says it with the descendants of Shet. Perhaps just came to me right now. The reason why it doesn't say that Cain gave birth in the image of God, because perhaps Cain did not tell his son that I'm giving birth in the image of God. Maybe Cain did not pass that on. So the Torah is not going to tell it to us, not because it's not true. Of course it's true. But Cain didn't tell it to his son. So his son figured, if I'm descending, I have no choice. Now, with Shet, the Torah says, oh, Adam gave birth to Shet, and he gave birth in his own image. So with Shet's lineage, it says that they're being born in the image of God. Maybe that means that the parents actually gave this information to their children, which is why the Torah highlights it specifically in the family of Shet. Maybe yes, maybe no, take it or leave it. Either way, I won't be offended.
Yeah, it makes sense, because I think here he became more conscious about his responsibility to pass on something to the future generation. And, speaking of pattern, even if like there is a pattern here in giving names. First is descendant and ascent. Descendants, that looks like the grandchildren. So even if your parents gave you a name that's not very aspirational, then you can give the better name to your children, hoping for next generation to be to kind of rise above it.
Correct. Now, we're going to skip a little. I'm going to go back because I want to discuss Chanoch, which is interesting, but just because it's the theme that we're talking about, let's compare the two cousins, Lemech. Shet has a son, Cain has a son, Lemech, and Shet has a son, Lemech. So Cain's son, Lemech, we discussed already in chapter 4. We'll go back to it for a moment. We know he has 2 wives. We know he has 4 children, and we know that he sings a song. So that's plenty of information compared to the people between Cain and Noach. That's a lot of information. We have a lot of information about this guy, Lemech. If you turn back in the Art Scrolls, page 23, but it's Genesis chapter 4, verse number 19. And we discuss, I'm just doing it quickly. We read about he has 2 wives, 19. Lemech took to himself 2 wives. The name of one was Ada. The name of the second was Tzila. And we read about his 3 children, which we're going to skip about that. We're going to skip the 4 children and their careers. We'll go straight to verse 23. We have a song. Okay, song is interesting. 23. Lemech said to his wives, Ada and Sila, hear my voice. Wives of Lemech, give ear to my speech. Have I slain a man by my wound and a child by my bruise? If Cain suffered vengeance at 7 generations, Lemech at 77. And we discussed this at great length. I don't want to repeat everything we said, but what's clear is as follows. What seems to be, according to Rashi at least, we'll take Rashi's interpretation for this one. Lemech kills someone by mistake. By mistake means he wasn't careful enough. Happens to be, according to the Medrash, it's his grandfather Cain. He kills his grandfather Cain. His wives are separated from him. They don't want to deal with his murderer. They're afraid of him. He says, don't worry. And he says, is it my fault? And he evokes his great-grandfather Cain. And one way to read this, he's saying, what do you want from me? Cain killed and I kill. I'm 7 generations later. I'm a product of Cain. And this is insight, perhaps, into the view and the philosophy of the descendants of Cain. So what is Lemech telling his wives? What's Lemech's theory? Lemech's theory is, this is a world where people are going to kill each other. That's just the nature. Look at my grandfather. Look at the story of our family. You can't escape the story of your family. That is really, at least according to some interpretations, according to Rashi, what Lemech is telling his wives. Now let's compare. We'll turn 2 pages. There's another gentleman, the distant cousin, descendant of Shet, and he's also named Lemech, and he happens to be the father of the person who will become Noach. But what does he say? So we're skipping ahead, page 27 in the Art Scroll, in Genesis chapter 5, verse 28. Lemech lived 182 years and begot his son, and he called his name Noach. Okay, we'll get to that, what Noach means, but he calls his name Noach, saying, this one will bring us rest or comfort, depending on who you ask. This one will bring us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands, from the ground which Hashem has cursed. Lemech lived to 590 years after begetting Noach, and he begot sons and daughters. So what is he saying about his son? Again, Bob, I believe this is aspirational. He doesn't know for sure. Some people say that Lemech was a prophet, but it doesn't matter if he was a prophet. Even if he wasn't a genuine prophet, his prophecy was self-fulfilling. And so Noach grows up in a house where his father tells him, you will bring us rest from the hard work. You will help people rest from the terrible labor that we have to work in the ground because God cursed the ground. And according to the Medrash, Noach actually helped produce and develop the plow. In other words, tools for agriculture, and actually gave people rest. And there are other interpretations of what this means. But let's just take the simple interpretation that Rashi quotes. Noach actually created the plow. He did other things to bring comfort. He saved the world, but we'll get to, and the father could not have known that. So you have 2 Lemechs. One Lemech tells his wives, listen, I killed somebody. It's not my fault. I'm a descendant of Cain. Cain killed someone. I'm going to kill someone. That's one attitude. And that attitude takes us straight to the flood. In other words, that attitude takes us directly toward destruction, because there's no hope for breaking the negative pattern and understanding that even though people would have negative instincts, people could escape and be free and free themselves of those instincts by transcending them and by exercising free choice. Meanwhile, the other Lemech, what does he say? He says, we have a child. We're at the bris. There was no bris, but you get what I'm saying. At the party, when they welcome the child home, they name him Noach, and they say, this guy, this little kid, he is going to bring us comfort. The future, he's going to bring rest. He's going to bring happiness. He's going to do better than his parents. And that perhaps is what, now we don't know for sure, everybody has free choice, but it's no surprise that the child growing up in that environment ends up actually being the one to bring comfort to humanity. So again, the theme that you see within the lineage of Cain and the lineage of Shet, you see it play out even more strikingly with the 2 Lemechs. And again, the people who study, the Bible critics, they tell you that when the Torah gives you two names and makes comparisons, the Torah wants you to look at both of them carefully and compare the two. So you have a Lemech and a Lemech. You compare the two Lemechs and you see their attitudes, how much they differ, and that's telling. And that's how, and there's a message in the way the Torah does that. So I thought that was beautiful because you see the big picture also playing out with the individual two people named Lemech. Okay, Adkan, any questions, comments, please share. Otherwise, we go backward because we still have to deal with the other individual who's interesting here. We have some information about him, which is Chanoch.
One question, Rabbi.
Yes.
Unless I made a mathematical error, it looks like if you look at when they became parents, you must have had many generations alive at one time.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, you have an overlap. I mean, from what I could see, it looks like 7 or 8 generations existing at the same time.
Yeah, I read a commentary this morning that says the reason why Lemech names his son Noach, which Noach, according to some interpretations, means comfort. It's a debate if it means comfort or rest. We'll get to that later. But he names his son Comfort. Some people say until Lemech, nobody died. In other words, you had Hevel was killed, but at least the people mentioned in this verse, nobody died. Lemech was the first one who had his 3 generations before him die, who witnessed the death of Adam, and then 2 other people in his lineage. But up to that point, all those generations, all the way to Lemech, so you have 9 generations really living simultaneously. And only at the 9th do people start dying. So your math is good.
And just to add to your argument about free choice, the interesting comparison between the 2 Lemechs, seeing that there's no real Hebrew connotation to them, call them John Doe.
Right.
So one John Doe had free choice and ended up accidentally killing Cain. The other John Doe found free choice and ended up giving birth to Noah. Right.
And again, so what's the change? So the change is the attitude. In other words, the Torah, despite the fact that we have free choice, but again, what we believe about ourselves, maybe that's the message. What we believe about ourselves is critically important to understand, to be able to exercise our free choice. If I believe that I don't have free choice, that even though God gave me the power, if I believe that I don't have free choice, I'm going to have a very difficult time discovering that I do. I may be able to, but there's a lot of obstacles in my way. If I believe that I have free choice, then it's much easier for me to experience that. So what people believe about themselves, the stories we tell ourselves are critical, which is why the Torah keeps telling us, and we're coming to the spring now, everything in the Torah is remembrance of the Exodus of Egypt, the idea of freedom, which represents the idea of free choice. And Maimonides says it's a great principle of the Torah. The most important principle is free choice. If we don't believe this, then we're going to be trapped. And if you believe you're free, then you're free. So despite the fact that we have the potential for free choice, and we have the power for free choice, but if I believe I'm powerless, then I can have all the power in the world. But if I believe I'm powerless, it's going to be much harder for me to discover that power. It's possible that I will, but the odds are against me.
Rabbi, can you repeat, who is the first person we think died naturally?
They want to know I have to go back and check that. If you do the math, I think the first person was, I have to go back and check. It could have been Chanoch, it could have been Adam. I'll go back and check. I'm not going to pull out the calculator right now, but give me a moment. Maybe I'll try to see the. I'll look at my notes. Give me just a second. Okay, I'm quoting from my notes. When when Lemech was 56 years old, Adam dies. When Lemech was 113, his grandfather's Chanoch dies. The Torah doesn't say he died. We'll discuss him. But his grandfather Chanoch is taken away. When he's 168, Shet dies. So now he has three. Once his third ancestor dies, a little while after that, Noach is born. So there's a theory that says that the reason why he's called, they name his child Noach, which is Zayid Achamenu. This one will comfort us, even though again I keep emphasizing that Rashi does not think that Yenachamenu is comfort, but others do. And certainly the simple reading Yenachem is in modern Hebrew is to comfort. So some people would say Lemech again. Lemech is the first one who's really experiencing the curse of Adam. Of the curse that God says that Adam will die, and he's really experiencing death and loss, and therefore, where does he turn to comfort? He turns to the next generation. But again, this will only follow the opinion that would say that, I guess it doesn't have to. It could be according to both opinions. Even if other people died earlier, they were not significant in Lemech's life. But in other words, these important. So again, it probably works better according to the interpretation that everybody lived long, but if only some people lived long, then it's not as convincing. But either way, you could say that these people were these 10 generations were very significant in their times, and then when they die, it makes an impact on Lemech, and therefore he hopes that his child will bring comfort. Okay, now we get to some strange verses. It's cryptic verses. We're not exactly sure what happens. So if you turn to Chanoch, if you turn to chapter, and the article, it's page 25, verse 21. If you have a different chumash, it's Genesis chapter 5, verse 21. So we have Chanoch, verse 21, Chanoch, they translate Enoch. I don't know who wrote this, but in Hebrew it's Chanoch, so excuse me for using the Hebrew. Chanoch lived 65 years and begat Metushelach. Chanoch walked with God for 300 years after begetting Metushelach, and he begot sons and daughters. So he gives birth at 65, and then he dies, and then he gives birth to a son named Metushelach. Then it says he walks. Chanoch walked with God for 300 years. He walked with God. He's a young man. He's only 365 years old. That's like he's a little bit over the first third of the age of how many years those people were living. In any case, he begot sons and daughters. Verse 23, all the days of Chanoch were 365 years, and Chanoch walked with God. Then he was no more. In Hebrew, ve'einenu, he is gone, for God has taken him. Very, very strange. What is the verse telling us? What does it mean he's gone? What does it mean God took him? What does it mean he's walking before God? What does it mean what's the significance of the fact that he died so young? He's a very young child. He's a very young man, 365 years old. 365 is an interesting note. It's the days of the year. Go ahead, Warren.
Well, Rabbi, you said he died. Are we so sure he died?
No, we're not sure. Ve'einenu, he's gone.
He's gone. All the others, there's a reference to he died.
Yeah, but it does say God took him. Look, you're right. You're 100% right. It doesn't say he died, but it says for God had taken him. Right?
Is this pre Elijah?
It's to Elijah. But with Elijah, we say he's taken to heaven. So it's also it's some form of death, but it's not death the way everybody else dies. So there's something is unique about this gentleman Chanoch. We don't necessarily have enough information, and that's why, of course, there are two opinions. I mean, there are more than two opinions, but there are two general opinions. One opinion, and that's the opinion that Rashi quotes, is we have a problem here. On one hand, we have to think he's righteous. Why do we have, in other words, let's say we have to evaluate what's the story with Chanoch, with all the clues that the Torah gives us. So let's look at the the side of the pros. What makes us think he's righteous? First of all, it says Chanoch walked with God. That walking with God seems to be righteous. Who else walks with God? Later on, you'll see that Noah walks with God. If you turn the page, if you turn a few pages to page 31, which is the first verse of the portion of Noah. These are the offsprings of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. So we assume that walking with God is positive. With Abraham, it also says, God says, Hitalech lefanai, walk before me. So walking with God, walking before God, that seems to be a positive. Wonderful. Another positive is Warren's point. It doesn't say he died. Doesn't say he died. So I guess he died at some point. I mean, I haven't seen him hiding out in Greenwich. So I guess he died at some point, but it doesn't say he died. So that is, God takes him. God takes him. That represents holiness. That represents some form of passing on without the pain of death, really. It's not the experience of death. We'll talk about that maybe. What that means in a moment. But again, so we have two indicators, very strong indicators that he is positive. The other, however, the fact that he dies young is very surprising. And not only is it surprising because we're all great mathematicians and we could actually calculate how and realize that he died young, but the Torah itself draws your attention. He's gone. So there's sort of a void, a vacuum. He's gone. It doesn't say he died, but it says he's gone. So it's sort of drawing our attention to this. So therefore, that seems to be saying he's taken away prematurely. So what does Rashi say? Rashi has an interesting interpretation, which is that he's righteous, but God senses that he could be influenced by the people of his generation. So God takes him away. It says, he's gone because God took him. God takes him away prematurely in order that he shouldn't become wicked. That's what Rashi says. Again, there are multiple interpretations. That's Rashi. I wonder if it's in the English here. If you look at the article on page 25, number 24, although Chanoch was a righteous man, he was liable to go astray. To avert this, God cut his life short, as implied by the expression "he was no more" rather than "he died," i.e., he was no more in the world to complete his allotted years. That's Rashi. So that's one interpretation. It's not the only interpretation.
Rabbi,
yeah.
Might there also be a connection that it's like Joseph? Ruvain says of Joseph that Eneno,
he's gone. But what isn't it? So Joseph, we know that they thought he died. So if you're going to compare it to Joseph, then the idea of being gone, the idea of gone, you would use for someone who passes away. So that's something to think about. Okay, so that's Rashi, like I said, but there are other interpretations.
Question, Rabbi.
Yes.
I mean, conversely, couldn't Hashem have left him to have a positive influence on the other people who were existing at that point?
Right. So Rashi's reading of the story, Rashi's reading of Chanoch is that some people are righteous, but they're prone to be influenced. They're not leaders. And so Rashi reads this as telling him that indeed, if he would be left in this world, not only would he not have influenced others the way Abraham will in the future, but he would be influenced. So God knows that. And therefore, because he's righteous, God says, we're not going to let him play out his free choice because he doesn't have what it takes to withstand the peer pressure. And therefore, he was taken away. So in that sense, Chanoch seems to be somebody who, while he was righteous, but it's almost a critique that his righteousness would not be able to survive the pressure of the generation. And therefore, as a kindness, God takes him away. Other people read it differently. The Medrash says that Chanoch is the 7th generation. If you count generations from Adam, he's the 7th. And 7th is considered holy in the Bible. And the Medrash compares it to Hanoch being the seventh from Adam is similar to Moses being the seventh of the patriarchs from Abraham. If you take Abraham, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then you have Levi, Amram, Kahat, and Moshe. You get to 7. So the 7 is considered something very holy. So in that sense, the Medrash seems to be saying, no, Hanoch is very positive, and it's only positive. And some commentators say the fact that he's 365 represents, he lives 365 years. That represents a complete cycle, because it's the 365 is the number for the solar year. So that represents a completeness, a wholeness. But what does it mean that God took him? So here's what we say. Even the problem with his righteousness, even according to this interpretation, is that he was a loner. In other words, he was mostly concerned about his own connection to God, and therefore he was an ascetic. He was separate from the rest of generation. He did not interact with people. And that's why God takes him away. Not because he's going to sin, but because in some sense, he has no interest in being with people. He wants to be close to God. And that's what he gets. But of course, that's not the model that we're supposed to be. And therefore, he's actually closer to Noach, because Noach, it says that he walks with God. And we know already about Noach. We know that Noach does not end up influencing other people in his generation. Now, if you compare Chanoch, add Noach to Abraham, with Abraham, it doesn't say that he walked with God. It's God tells him, walk before me. Walking before God means you're walking with the people. You're not holding on to God's hand. You're much more within society, as we know that was the story of Abraham's life, spreading the knowledge of God in the world. So according to this reading, even if you think that Noach is not, that Chanoch would not have become wicked the way Rashi does, but when the Torah says he's gone because God took him, in some sense, it's a critique. Why is God taking him? Let me just repeat. He's gone doesn't mean he's gone after he dies. He's gone in his lifetime. Chanoch walked with God, ve'inenu, but he's not here. Why is he not here? Because all the people say he's not here. He's in the synagogue. He's on the 3rd floor in the attic studying Torah. He's not here. He's not with people. So that's a beautiful interpretation. Ve'inenu, this is, who says this? I have to find who says this. Ve'inenu is that even he's gone. Even when he's alive, he's gone. That's what, if you look at verse 24, Chanoch walked with God, which we say that means he's with God, he's not with people. Not then he was no more. The exact word is ve'inenu, and he is absent, and he is not here. Why is he not here? Not because he died. He didn't die yet. In his lifetime, he's not here. For God had taken him. That's the description of death. Now, Warren wants to know why it doesn't say he died. So you see, you have other examples in the Torah where it doesn't say die. Elijah is the most clear, but even people who did not go up to heaven, so to speak, even Jacob, for example, it says he was gathered to his people. And Rashi says that righteous people, it doesn't say the word died. It says a different expression. And we know, like, when it comes to Aaron and Miriam and Moses, it does say they died, but it says by the mouth of God. So there are different expressions of how you discuss death. And it seems to be saying that the more righteous the person is, the less pain there is of death. Because think about this. Most people, when they die, for the soul, because the soul is connected to earth and connected to people on earth, then even though the soul is going back to heaven and going back to its source and connecting to God, and it's a great joy for the soul, but it is also painful in some sense because the soul is separating from its acquaintances on this earth. So for most people, for most souls, death is a mixed experience. It's bittersweet. It's joyous because the soul gets back to its source, but it's sad because it's, in some sense, it's separating from the people it loves. The separation is not absolute. Now there's a spiritual connection, as we're discussing in the JLI at great length, but nevertheless, there's some sort of pain. But when it comes to Chanoch, who even when he's alive, he's separate from his family. He's separate from his people. He's walking with God, not with other people. So it doesn't say death. It doesn't say death because to his soul, it doesn't feel the sense of separation because the soul was not connected to begin with. Now, is this the proper road for the Jew? Is this the proper road for the model of living life on this earth? Of course not. That's not what God wants. But on the other hand, in that generation, the fact that the person Hanoch was able to remain so spiritually connected to God in the face of all the immorality that was taking place, for that generation, that was a wonderful thing. But ultimately, that's obviously not the goal. Even Noach's lifestyle wasn't the goal. Ultimately, the goal is to walk with God, in front of God, with people, and that's the model that Abraham shows for us. So that's the story of Hanoch. In some sense, it's praising him, but in some sense, it's a critique to him. And the reader, us, we're supposed to read, don't be like Hanoch. Don't be gone even in your lifetime. Don't be gone. Your kids shouldn't think you're gone when you're still alive. I guess that's the takeaway. So thank you very much for joining. I hope everybody had a wonderful Purim and weekend and Shabbos, and hope to see you soon in good health. As soon as everybody's vaccinated, we can get together and study in person. So I guess with the vaccination, we'll get the good weather, and then we can be outside and everybody will be happy. Wonderful. Any questions, comments, jokes, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful, wonderful week.
Thank you,
Rabbi, are you vaccinated?